Welcome to this journey of one of the most disturbing cases in recorded history of the Arkansas Ozark Mountains. Before we begin, I invite you to leave a comment about where you're watching from and the exact time you heard this story. We're interested in knowing where and at what times of day or night these documented accounts arrive. The winter of 1887 in the remote valleys of Newton County, Arkansas, was particularly harsh. Snow had fallen early that October, blanketing the rugged terrain of the Ozark Mountains in an oppressive silence that seemed to muffle even the wind. It was in this isolated wilderness, where families lived miles apart and neighbors were counted in hours of travel rather than minutes, that one of the most methodical and psychologically devastating hunting campaigns in American frontier history would unfold. The events began with what appeared to be a simple theft. A moonshine still belonging to Mordecai Hatfield, patriarch of a clan that had settled along Buffalo Creek some 15 years prior, had been dismantled and relocated during the night of October 3, 1887. The still, a sophisticated copper apparatus worth considerable money for its time, represented not just financial loss, but a violation of the unwritten codes that governed survival in these mountains. Mordecai Hatfield was not a man given to displays of emotion or rash decisions. At 52, he had survived the Civil War, multiple harsh winters, and the constant threat of federal revenue agents who occasionally swept through the hills seeking illegal distilleries. His reputation throughout Newton County was that of a man who spoke little, but whose words, when spoken, carried the weight of absolute certainty. Those who knew him described a tall, lean figure with penetrating gray eyes and hands that rarely moved without purpose. The Hatfield homestead sat at the end of a narrow valley, accessible only by a single dirt path that wound through dense oak and hickory forests. The main house, built of hand-hewn logs, faced east toward the creek, while a series of outbuildings stretched back toward the tree line. It was behind these structures, in a carefully concealed hollow, that Mordecai had operated his still for over a decade without incident. On the morning of October 4th, when Mordecai discovered the theft, he made no immediate announcement to his family. Instead, he spent the day examining the site with methodical precision, studying every footprint, every broken twig, every disturbance in the soil. According to a journal kept by his wife Temperance, discovered in 1963 during the renovation of an old church in nearby Jasper, Mordecai returned to the house that evening and simply stated, "12 men took what was ours. 12 men will answer for it." How Mordecai arrived at this specific number was never explained in any surviving record. The footprints around the still site, according to a county sheriff's report filed weeks later, were too numerous and overlapping to count with certainty. Yet Mordecai's conviction about the number remained absolute, and over the following weeks, this precision would take on an almost ritualistic significance. The Hatfield clan at that time consisted of Mordecai, his wife Temperance, and their 3 adult sons, Zedekiah, aged 28, Phineas, 26, and Obadiah, 23. Unlike their father, the sons were known in the community for their volatile temperaments and their tendency toward confrontation. Zedekiah, the eldest, had served time in the state prison at Little Rock for assault. Phineas was suspected in the disappearance of a revenue agent 2 years prior, though no charges were ever filed. Obadiah, despite being the youngest, was perhaps the most feared, possessing what locals described as an unnerving ability to track anyone through the dense Ozark wilderness. In the weeks following the theft, the Hatfield family began what appeared to be a systematic information-gathering campaign throughout the county. They visited general stores, attended church services they had previously avoided, and engaged in conversations with neighbors who had not seen them socially in years. This sudden sociability struck many as unusual, but few questioned it directly. The social isolation of mountain families often led to periodic attempts at community re-engagement. What made these interactions particularly unsettling, according to later testimony given to county officials, was the nature of the questions the Hatfields asked. They inquired about recent purchases of copper tubing, about who might have been traveling the mountain roads on specific dates, about which families had suddenly come into unexplained money or resources. The questions were asked casually, woven into broader conversations about weather and crops, but their cumulative effect was to create a comprehensive map of who might have had the means, opportunity, and motivation to steal the still. Bartholomew Wickham, who operated a general store in nearby Parthenon, later described one such visit from Zedekiah Hatfield in November of 1887. According to Wickham's account, preserved in a statement given to the Arkansas State Police in 1923, Zedekiah spent over an hour in the store, making small purchases and engaging in seemingly friendly conversation. However, throughout this time, he systematically inquired about every customer who had purchased copper items, coal, or large quantities of grain in recent months. He weren't threatening, Wickham reportedly stated, but there was something in the way he asked things, like he already knew the answers and was just checking to see if you'd tell him the truth. Made a man feel like every word might be the wrong one. By December of 1887, the Hatfield family had apparently identified their 12 suspects. The criteria for this identification process remained unclear, but the list, when it was eventually discovered among family papers in 1965, revealed a pattern that suggested careful consideration of both opportunity and capability. The men ranged in age from 22 to 55, lived within a 15-mile radius of the Hatfield property, and all had either the knowledge necessary to dismantle a complex distillery or had demonstrated hostility toward the Hatfield family in the past. The list included Cornelius Ashworth, a blacksmith who had previously refused to repair Hatfield equipment, Silas Pemberton, who had disputed property boundaries with Mordecai 3 years earlier, and Jeremiah Quincy, whose own still had been destroyed by revenue agents and who might have needed replacement equipment. Others on the list seemed to have been included for more subtle offenses. Nathaniel Bromley, who had been heard making disparaging comments about the Hatfield family's war record. Ezekiel Tanner, who had courted Temperance Hatfield before her marriage to Mordecai, and Augustus Cromwell, who had testified against Zedekiah during his assault trial. What followed was not a traditional frontier confrontation or a series of violent reprisals. Instead, the Hatfield family embarked on what can only be described as a campaign of psychological warfare designed to systematically destroy the mental stability and social standing of each man on their list. The campaign began with Cornelius Ashworth. According to his wife's testimony, given to a traveling preacher in 1888 and recorded in church records discovered in 1967, Ashworth began receiving anonymous messages left at his smithy. These were not typical threats, but instead consisted of detailed observations about his daily routines, descriptions of his private conversations with his wife, and information about his business dealings that no outsider should have possessed. The messages escalated in their intimate knowledge of Ashworth's life. They mentioned the location of money he had hidden, described injuries he had received years earlier and told no one about, and referenced childhood memories that he had shared with no one except his wife. The implication was clear. Someone was watching his every move, listening to his private conversations, and had access to information that should have been impossible to obtain. Ashworth's mental state began to deteriorate rapidly. He started checking and rechecking the locks on his shop, would interrupt conversations to listen for sounds that others could not hear, and began sleeping with a loaded rifle beside his bed. His work suffered as he became increasingly distracted and paranoid. Customers noticed his hands shaking as he worked, and several commented on his habit of stopping suddenly to stare out the windows as if expecting to see someone watching. The campaign against Silas Pemberton took a different form. Pemberton was a proud man who valued his reputation in the community above almost everything else. Rather than threatening him directly, the Hatfields began spreading carefully crafted rumors about his character and business dealings. These rumors were never dramatic enough to be dismissed as obviously false, but they were damaging enough to slowly erode his standing in the community. Stories began circulating that Pemberton had been seen meeting secretly with federal revenue agents. Other rumors suggested he had been cheating customers in his timber business, selling them inferior wood while charging premium prices. Still others hinted at improper relationships with married women in the community. Each rumor was subtle, plausible, and impossible to definitively disprove. Pemberton found himself increasingly isolated as neighbors began treating him with suspicion and distrust. Business declined as customers took their dealings elsewhere. Church members avoided him, and invitations to social gatherings stopped coming. The gradual nature of this social ostracism made it particularly devastating, as Pemberton could never point to any single act or accusation that had ruined his reputation. For Jeremiah Quincy, the psychological assault focused on his family's safety. Quincy lived in a remote cabin with his wife and elderly mother, isolated by several miles from the nearest neighbor. The Hatfields exploited this isolation by creating the impression that the family was under constant surveillance and potential threat. Quincy would find his livestock moved to different fields overnight, with gates left open in ways that suggested human intervention rather than accidental escape. Tools would disappear from his barn only to reappear days later in locations where he was certain to find them, but arranged in patterns that seemed deliberate and meaningful. Footprints would appear around his house after fresh snowfalls, circling the building in a methodical pattern that suggested careful observation of every window and door. Perhaps most unnerving were the sounds that Quincy and his family began hearing at night. According to a letter written by Quincy's wife to her sister in Missouri, found among family papers in 1962, these sounds consisted of what appeared to be multiple people moving through the woods around their cabin, but always staying just outside the range of vision. The sounds would continue for hours, sometimes all night, but would stop abruptly whenever Quincy attempted to investigate. The psychological pressure on Quincy's family was intensified by their complete isolation. They could not verify whether the threats were real or imagined, could not seek help without traveling dangerous distances, and could not escape the feeling that they were being systematically terrorized by an invisible enemy who knew their every move and vulnerability. As winter deepened, the campaign against the 12 men intensified. Nathaniel Bromley began receiving visits from strangers who claimed to be traveling salesmen, but who asked detailed questions about his family, his finances, and his daily routines. These visitors would appear at irregular intervals, always polite, but always probing for information that had no apparent commercial purpose. Ezekiel Tanner discovered that someone had been entering his house while he was away. Nothing was stolen, but personal items were rearranged in ways that made it clear that every room had been carefully searched. Books were left open to specific pages. Drawers were left partially open in patterns that spelled out messages. And food was consumed in quantities that suggested the intruders had made themselves comfortable during their searches. Augustus Cromwell found his horse dead one morning, apparently from natural causes, but positioned in his dooryard in a way that blocked his exit and forced him to dispose of the carcass before he could leave his property. The timing of the death, just before an important court appearance where Cromwell was scheduled to testify in another case, suggested that the incident might not have been entirely natural. By January of 1888, several of the targeted men had reached breaking points. Cornelius Ashworth had abandoned his smithy and moved his family to relatives in Missouri. Silas Pemberton had sold his property at a significant loss and relocated to Little Rock. Jeremiah Quincy had suffered what a traveling doctor described as a nervous collapse and was confined to his bed under the care of his wife and mother. However, the most disturbing aspect of the Hatfield campaign was not its effectiveness against these individual targets, but the systematic way in which it was documented and refined. According to papers discovered in a cavity wall during the demolition of the old Hatfield homestead in 1959, Mordecai kept detailed records of each action taken against each target, noting the psychological effects and adjusting tactics accordingly. These records, written in Mordecai's careful handwriting, read more like clinical observations than personal revenge notes. He documented which approaches produced the fastest results, which men proved more resistant to psychological pressure, and which family members could be most effectively used to increase pressure on the primary targets. One entry dated February 15, 1888 reads, "See, Ashworth departed for Missouri Territory yesterday." Method of anonymous correspondence proved most effective for subjects of solitary disposition. Note: detailed personal knowledge more unsettling than direct threats. S. Pemberton requires different approach due to social nature. Reputation destruction proving slower but more complete. The clinical nature of these observations suggests that the Hatfield family had moved beyond simple revenge into something approaching psychological experimentation. They appeared to be testing different methods of mental coercion and documenting the results for future reference. As winter gave way to spring in 1888, the focus of the campaign began to shift toward the remaining targets who had proven more resistant to psychological pressure. These men, perhaps understanding what was happening to their neighbors, had begun taking defensive measures. Some had formed informal alliances, visiting each other regularly and providing mutual support. Others had reached out to county authorities, though with limited success given the remote location and the difficulty of proving that they were being systematically terrorized. The response from the Hatfield family to these defensive measures was to escalate their campaign in ways that pushed the boundaries of what could be dismissed as coincidence or natural misfortune. Farm equipment began malfunctioning in dangerous ways that could have resulted in serious injury. Wells became contaminated with substances that made the water undrinkable, but that could plausibly have occurred through natural contamination. Bridges and fences suffered structural failures that appeared to be the result of natural weathering, but that occurred with suspicious timing and frequency. Throughout this period, the Hatfield family maintained an appearance of normal community involvement. They attended church services, participated in local events, and engaged in ordinary social interactions with neighbors who were not on their target list. This dual existence, maintaining normalcy while conducting systematic psychological warfare, required a level of planning and emotional control that speaks to the organized nature of their campaign. Temperance Hatfield's journal entries from this period, discovered among church papers in 1965, provide insight into the family dynamics during the campaign. Rather than expressing guilt or concern about their actions, the entries reveal a family that had convinced itself that their targets deserved whatever psychological suffering they experienced. Mordecai says a man who takes what belongs to another has already chosen to live outside the protection of decent society, she wrote in March of 1888. The boys understand this. We are not causing harm to innocent people. We are simply allowing guilty men to experience the consequences of their own choices. This rationalization appears to have been shared by all family members and may have been crucial in maintaining their psychological stability while conducting their campaign. By framing their actions as justice rather than revenge, they avoided the moral conflicts that might have undermined their effectiveness. The campaign reached its climax in the spring of 1888 when the remaining targets began disappearing from the county. These were not violent disappearances accompanied by evidence of struggle or foul play. Instead, families simply packed their belongings and left the area, often in the middle of the night, abandoning property and possessions in their haste to escape. Augustus Cromwell left a note explaining his departure that was discovered by neighbors and later turned over to county authorities. The note, preserved in county records, stated simply, "Cannot bear the watching anymore. Every shadow might be them. Every sound might be a warning, taking my family where they cannot follow. Lomam." Similar departures occurred throughout the spring and summer of 1888. By autumn, all 12 men on Mordecai's original list had either died, suffered mental collapse, or fled the county. The Hatfield family had achieved their goal of making those they held responsible pay for the theft of their still. But they had done so through methods that were arguably more devastating than traditional violence. The effectiveness of their campaign created a lasting impact on the community that extended far beyond the immediate targets. Other families in the county became acutely aware of the price of crossing the Hatfield clan and began modifying their behavior accordingly. Disputes that might previously have been settled through direct confrontation or legal action were now avoided entirely. The psychological terrorism campaign had established a climate of fear that influenced community dynamics for years afterward. County officials attempted to investigate the pattern of departures and mental breakdowns, but they faced the same challenges that had hampered law enforcement throughout the frontier period. The remote location, the absence of direct evidence of criminal activity, and the reluctance of terrorized families to provide detailed testimony made it impossible to build a case against the Hatfield family. Sheriff Cornelius Blackwood, whose jurisdiction included Newton County, filed a report with state authorities in September of 1888, requesting assistance in investigating what he described as systematic intimidation and coercion by the Hatfield family. The report, discovered in state archives in 1961, provides one of the few official acknowledgments of the campaign's effectiveness. While no direct evidence of illegal activity can be established, Blackwood wrote, "The pattern of psychological distress, property abandonment, and population displacement in the vicinity of the Hatfield property strongly suggests organized intimidation. The family has achieved through fear what others might accomplish through violence, but the legal remedies available for addressing such activities are limited under current statutes." The state's response to Blackwood's request was minimal. A single investigator was sent to Newton County in October of 1888, but his 2-week investigation yielded no evidence of specific criminal acts. The investigator's report, also found in state archives, noted the unusual number of recent property transfers and relocations in the area, but concluded that, while suspicious, these events do not constitute evidence of criminal behavior sufficient to warrant prosecution. Following the state investigation, the Hatfield family gradually reduced their visibility in the community. They ceased their attendance at social events, limited their interactions with neighbors, and returned to the isolation that had characterized their existence before the theft of their still. This withdrawal was not complete invisibility, but rather a strategic reduction in contact that maintained their psychological presence while limiting their exposure to further official scrutiny. The final phase of the campaign occurred in late 1888 and early 1889, when the few remaining men who had been on Mordecai's original list but had not yet fled the county began experiencing what can only be described as total social and economic isolation. Businesses refused to serve them, neighbors avoided contact, and even family members began distancing themselves to avoid being associated with the perceived curse that seemed to follow anyone who had crossed the Hatfield family. This social exile was perhaps more devastating than the earlier psychological terrorism because it removed the last vestiges of normal human contact and community support. The men found themselves living as outcasts in their own communities, unable to conduct business, maintain relationships, or participate in the social structures that defined frontier life. Jeremiah Quincy, who had remained in the county despite his earlier nervous collapse, provides the most detailed record of this final phase through letters he wrote to relatives in other states. These letters, discovered among family papers in 1964, describe a gradual descent into complete social invisibility. "No one speaks to me anymore," he wrote in December of 1888. "When I enter the general store, other customers leave. The shopkeeper serves me, but will not meet my eyes. My own neighbors pass my house without acknowledgment, as if I have died, but continue to walk among the living. I begin to understand why the others left. This is not life as God intended it." Quincy's final letter, dated January 15, 1889, was written to his sister in Missouri. "I cannot remain here any longer. The weight of their attention has become unbearable. Even when I see none of them, I know they are watching. Even when I hear nothing, I know they are listening. A man cannot live under such scrutiny without losing his mind. I am leaving tomorrow for places where their eyes cannot follow." Quincy's departure marked the completion of Mordecai Hatfield's campaign of revenge. All 12 men he had held responsible for the theft of his still had been driven from the county or reduced to such psychological devastation that they posed no further threat to his family's interests. The campaign had taken 18 months to complete and had been conducted with a systematic precision that demonstrated sophisticated understanding of human psychology and social dynamics. The aftermath of the campaign created lasting changes in Newton County that persisted for decades. The sudden departure of 12 families, along with their extended relatives and close associates, significantly reduced the population of the area and altered its economic structure. Several businesses closed due to lack of customers, and the remaining population became notably more insular and cautious in their dealings with outsiders. More significantly, the psychological methods used by the Hatfield family became part of local folklore and influenced how disputes were conducted in the county for generations afterward. The threat of becoming the target of similar psychological warfare served as a powerful deterrent to direct confrontation, leading to a culture of indirect communication and careful avoidance of actions that might be interpreted as hostile. The Hatfield family themselves continued to live in Newton County until Mordecai's death in 1902. During the remaining years of his life, he maintained the demeanor of a respectable patriarch who had successfully defended his family's interests against those who would exploit them. His sons continued to operate in the county, but with a reputation for methodical ruthlessness that ensured they were rarely challenged directly. Temperance Hatfield's later journal entries, covering the period from 1890 to her death in 1895, reveal a woman who had become increasingly isolated by her knowledge of what her family had accomplished. While she continued to justify their actions in moral terms, her writings suggest growing uncertainty about the psychological costs of their campaign, both for their targets and for themselves. "Mordecai speaks often of justice being served," she wrote in 1893, "but I sometimes wonder if we have become something other than what God intended when we chose to answer theft with such complete destruction. The men who wronged us are gone, but the weight of their departure remains with us. We live now in a county that fears us, and there are times when I am not certain that fear and respect are the same thing." The historical record of the Ozark Massacre, as it came to be known in local folklore, was largely forgotten outside of Newton County until 1959, when the demolition of the original Hatfield homestead led to the discovery of Mordecai's detailed records. These documents, along with the various journals, letters, and official reports that surfaced over the following decade, provided the first comprehensive view of what had actually occurred during those 18 months in 1887 and 1888. Dr. Harrison Metcalf, a psychology professor at the University of Arkansas who studied the case in 1967, described the Hatfield campaign as one of the most sophisticated examples of systematic psychological warfare documented in American frontier history. His analysis, published in an academic journal that year, noted that the family had intuitively employed psychological techniques that would not be formally understood by clinical psychology for several decades. The Hatfield family demonstrated an understanding of isolation anxiety, social ostracism, and psychological manipulation that suggests either exceptional natural insight into human psychology or previous experience with such techniques. Metcalf wrote, "Their ability to maintain the campaign over an extended period while avoiding direct criminal exposure indicates planning and emotional control that approaches the level of organized psychological operations." Ori. The case attracted the attention of federal researchers in the late 1960s who were studying historical examples of psychological warfare for military applications. However, their findings were classified and remain unavailable to civilian researchers, though some have speculated that the Hatfield methods influenced later military psychological operations training. The lasting impact of the Ozark Massacre on the local population was documented in a sociological study conducted by graduate students from the University of Arkansas in 1965. The study found that even 77 years after the events, residents of Newton County demonstrated higher than normal rates of social anxiety, distrust of outsiders, and avoidance behaviors when compared to residents of neighboring counties. Interviews conducted during this study revealed that stories about the Hatfield campaign had been passed down through families for 3 generations, often with embellishments that increased their psychological impact. Many residents reported childhood warnings about the dangers of drawing attention or making enemies that were explicitly connected to the fate of the 12 men who had crossed the Hatfield family. One elderly resident, whose grandfather had been a neighbor of the Hatfields, told researchers, "My granddaddy always said there were things worse than dying, and that the Hatfields knew what those things were. He said a man could lose everything that made life worth living without ever being touched by a hand or threatened with a weapon." That lesson stuck in our family, and I reckon it stuck in others too. The physical location where the Hatfield homestead once stood remained avoided by local residents well into the 1960s. Despite the economic value of the land for farming or development, no one purchased the property after it was abandoned by the family. Local real estate agents reported that potential buyers would withdraw their offers after learning the history of the location, and several attempts to develop the land were abandoned due to workers' reluctance to remain on the site. In 1967, a team of researchers from the Smithsonian Institution attempted to conduct an archaeological survey of the Hatfield property as part of a larger study of frontier settlement patterns. The project was terminated after 3 weeks when team members reported experiencing unusual psychological stress while working at the site. The project leader's final report, filed with the Smithsonian in December 1967, noted that team members had experienced difficulty sleeping, increased anxiety, and persistent feelings of being watched while working at the location. While we cannot determine the cause of these psychological effects, the report stated, the consistency of symptoms among team members suggests that the location itself may have retained some environmental factor that negatively impacts human psychological well-being. Given the documented history of psychological trauma associated with this site, we recommend that further archaeological work be postponed indefinitely. The academic interest in the case gradually declined through the late 1960s and early 1970s as original documents became increasingly difficult to access. Several key records disappeared from archives under circumstances that were never explained, and surviving family members of both the Hatfields and their targets became reluctant to cooperate with researchers. By 1970, most of the physical evidence of the case had been lost, destroyed, or made inaccessible. The original homestead site had been purchased by the federal government for inclusion in a national forest preserve, effectively preventing further archaeological investigation. The county courthouse, where many official records had been stored, suffered a fire in 1968 that destroyed large portions of the historical archive, including most documents related to the Hatfield case. The few researchers who continued to study the case found themselves facing the same kind of systematic obstruction that had characterized the original events. Equipment would malfunction. Access permissions would be revoked without explanation, and key sources would become unavailable just before scheduled interviews. While no direct threats were made, the pattern of interference was so consistent that several researchers concluded they were being deliberately discouraged from continuing their work. Dr. Harrison Metcalf, whose 1967 analysis had been the most comprehensive academic study of the case, attempted to publish a follow-up paper in 1972, but found that the journal that had published his original work was no longer interested in the subject. Other academic publications also declined to consider his manuscript, citing concerns about historical verification and academic relevance. Metcalf's unpublished manuscript, discovered among his papers after his death in 1984, suggests that his continued research had uncovered connections between the Hatfield case and similar incidents of systematic psychological terrorism in other frontier regions. His notes indicate that he had begun to suspect that the techniques used by the Hatfield family were not unique innovations, but rather applications of methods that had been used by other families and organizations throughout the American frontier period. The sophistication of the Hatfield psychological operations suggests that such techniques may have been more common in frontier society than previously understood, he wrote in one section of the manuscript. The isolation of frontier communities, the limited effectiveness of law enforcement, and the need for deterrent effects against potential threats may have led to the development of systematic psychological warfare methods that have been largely overlooked by traditional historical scholarship. Metcalf's research notes also suggest that he had identified similar cases in Texas, Oklahoma, and Kentucky, all involving extended family groups that had used psychological terrorism to eliminate perceived threats while avoiding direct criminal prosecution. However, the details of these other cases remain unknown, as his research materials disappeared from the university archives following his death. The last serious academic examination of the Ozark Massacre was conducted in 1978 by a team of researchers from the University of Missouri who attempted to verify the basic facts of the case through oral history interviews with elderly residents of Newton County. The project was abandoned after 6 months when the research team was unable to find anyone willing to discuss the events in detail. The project leader's final report, filed with the university in 1979, noted that while residents clearly knew about the historical events, they demonstrated an unusual reluctance to provide specific information, even about matters that occurred before they were born. Many potential interview subjects claimed to have no knowledge of the case, despite evidence that their families had been directly affected by the events. The level of silence surrounding this historical incident is unlike anything we have encountered in other oral history projects, the report concluded. Even residents whose families immigrated to the area decades after the events show reluctance to discuss the subject, suggesting that the community has developed cultural mechanisms for avoiding examination of these particular historical events. Today, more than a century after the Ozark Massacre, the case remains largely forgotten outside of Newton County, and even within the county it exists more as folklore than documented history. The few surviving records are scattered among various archives and private collections, making comprehensive analysis nearly impossible. The physical locations associated with the events have been absorbed into federal land or developed for other uses, erasing most traces of the original settlement patterns. Yet the psychological impact of the case continues to influence the culture of Newton County in subtle ways. Residents still demonstrate higher than average levels of social caution, indirect communication styles, and avoidance of direct confrontation. Local law enforcement reports unusually low rates of property crime and interpersonal disputes, which may reflect the lasting deterrent effect of the Hatfield example. The story of Mordecai Hatfield and his systematic campaign of psychological revenge serves as a disturbing reminder of the human capacity for calculated cruelty. Without resorting to direct violence, the Hatfield family demonstrated that it was possible to destroy lives, families, and entire communities through the systematic application of fear, isolation, and psychological pressure. Perhaps most disturbing is the evidence that their methods were effective not only against their immediate targets, but in creating lasting changes in community behavior that persisted for generations. The Ozark Massacre represents a case study in the power of psychological terrorism to achieve social control through the creation of pervasive fear and the demonstration that resistance to certain individuals or families would result in consequences more devastating than death itself. The 12 men who disappeared from Newton County in 1887 and 1888 were not killed in any traditional sense, but they were effectively eliminated as surely as if they had been shot or hanged. Their fate serves as a reminder that human cruelty can take forms that are far more subtle and arguably more devastating than direct violence, and that the American frontier produced not only legendary gunfighters and violent outlaws, but also individuals capable of psychological warfare techniques that would not be out of place in modern military or intelligence operations. In the end, the true horror of the Ozark Massacre lies not in what was done to the 12 men, but in how completely and systematically it was accomplished, and in the evidence that such techniques may have been far more common in frontier society than traditional historical accounts suggest. The Hatfield family's campaign represents a glimpse into a darker aspect of American frontier psychology, one that reveals the potential for ordinary families to become instruments of calculated psychological destruction when they believe themselves to be defending their fundamental interests. The silence that has surrounded this case for more than a century may itself be part of the Hatfield legacy, a community-wide psychological scar that continues to influence behavior long after the original perpetrators and victims have passed away. In a society that values direct action and clear moral distinctions, the Ozark Massacre reminds us that the most devastating forms of human conflict may be those that operate below the surface, in the realm of fear, uncertainty, and psychological manipulation, where traditional notions of justice and law enforcement have little power to intervene. The mountains of Arkansas still echo with this story, carried in the whispered warnings passed from generation to generation, in the caution that governs interpersonal relationships, and in the understanding that some families possess knowledge and capabilities that extend far beyond what their outward appearance might suggest. The Hatfield name may no longer strike fear into the hearts of Newton County residents, but the methods they pioneered continue to serve as a template for psychological dominance that requires no weapons other than patience, intelligence, and an understanding of the human need for community acceptance and psychological security.